Madam President, during the summer, Democrats and Republicans, as Americans well remember, had a big political dust-up over trying to reduce spending as we approached the nation's debt limit. As we know, the product of that fight was a leadership-brokered deal that promised long-term savings in discretionary spending of around $900 billion. It also created, that is, over 10 years, not just in 1 year. It also created the super committee, which has been meeting in secret to find another $1.2 trillion in possible savings. We hope they do. They should do more than that, frankly. Whatever they come up with must be voted on in the Senate, though, without any amendment, cannot be altered in any way. And this is concerning to me. Virtually every deal we've seen this year has been filled with promises of savings, but when you analyze them, the savings are not nearly as real as promised. So we don't need one more plan with tax hikes that never go away and promises of spending cuts that don't materialize or aren't continued. Indeed, the debt limit deal, which produced the Budget Control Act this summer, claims to contain a spending cap. But that is not accurate. It's a phony cap. The cuts that matter most are, in many respects, those that take place right away, of course. But after all that fussing and drama, we ended up with a deal that cut discretionary spending by only a paltry $7 billion from fiscal year 2012's discretionary budget. So last year, 11 discretionary budget. So to put this number in perspective, the total outlays for 2011 are $145 billion greater than 2010, and our deficit is nearly $1.3 trillion, $1,300 billion deficit. We're talking about promising a $7 billion reduction in spending. Nevertheless, $7 billion in discretionary cuts at least is real, a step, however small, in the right direction, right? We're supposed to spend $1,043 billion this year, down $7 billion from the $1,050 billion in discretionary spending expected. Unfortunately, last year. Unfortunately, this is just one more empty promise. Because the bill was rushed through, this Budget Control Act, in the 11th hour of the 59th minute, nobody knew that there was a gimmick in it at the time. Here's how it worked. The Budget Control Act created a cap adjustment for disaster relief funding. That's what they called it. It took a 10-year average for emergency spending and estimated that to be $11.3 billion for 2012. But this $11.3 billion in the Budget Control Act is a new fund, and it is spent by regular appropriations, not by 60 votes, as in the past for emergency spending, and it is above the $1,043 billion figure. So the truth is that the bill is not and never was $1,043 billion as promised, a limit on spending to that amount, but $1,054 billion. Spending, therefore, for discretionary accounts this year will be larger than last year. And the writers of the bill went on further. They changed the Senate rule in this Budget Control Act that was passed at the 59th minute of the 11th hour to eliminate the 60-vote rule even for emergency spending above the $11.3 billion. So the 60-vote point of order, which has been used here over the years to challenge a designation as an emergency spending, has been stripped as part of a bill denominated as a budget control act. So the new fund can be spent, this 11.3, at any time as a normal appropriation, as if it were within the budget and without any 60-vote requirement. This eliminates pressure to stay within the budget or to offset annual disaster spending, as we've been attempting to do, a number of us has in recent years. For instance, if you have $2 billion in disaster spending as part of a particular appropriation, instead of eliminating $2 billion in waste somewhere else in the budget to keep your total spending within the budget, you have a free access to the $11 billion fund and don't have to worry about offsetting a penny. You also don't need a vote for disaster funding approval. So this little offset issue has grown as a tribute to the effectiveness of Senator Tom Coburn, who has been fighting to offset so-called emergency spending designations, and the 60-vote requirement to pass an emergency bill gave him some leverage and ability to challenge that spending and challenge the appropriators to try to find offsets for the new spending. So I think we might call this, instead of the Budget Control Act, the Coburn Control Act. And I don't think it's a step forward for us. So the real spending cap now is $1,054 billion, $4 billion more than what we spent last year. And only if you want to spend even more than that do you need to go through an emergency designation process, but you don't need 60 votes even for that. So the irony here is that there was widespread belief in this chamber that we needed to tighten emergency spending designations. It was being abused. To give one unbelievable example, the Senate counted $210 million in the routine funding for the census as an emergency spending. And the census is in the Constitution. It's required to be conducted every 10 years. How in the world can we say this is an unexpected emergency spending? It's as routine as anything can possibly be. But it was done because otherwise you would need to cut spending by $200 million somewhere else. But the Budget Control Act has succeeded in actually weakening the standard for emergency spending and creates just one more loophole for the spenders. Again, the effect of the $11 billion fund is that it effectively nullifies the cap that we were promised. And the Appropriating Committee will have no incentive to achieve savings when they can spend every penny of the $1,043 billion base budget, knowing there's still another $11 billion to be spent when they run through the first part. So the evidence of this is before our very eyes. To this point, in one form or another, 7 appropriation bills have come before the Senate floor. 4 of them have been voted on and passed. Energy and water bill is before us this week. We should have been considering each of these bills individually, doing our due diligence on each one, but we haven't. We've moved in group. But I am glad that this bill, energy and water, will be considered on its own, not bundled with others. The bad news is that the 7 bills we've seen on the floor so far have already increased spending by $9 billion of the $11 billion for disaster, and we're well on our way to using every cent of the $11 billion because we have 6 more bills to pass. So the energy and water bill on the floor now increases spending over the budget amount by $1 billion. That may seem small in Washington terms, but that kind of thinking is the reason we're going broke. $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon it's real money. If we can't even reach the paltry goal, honestly, of a $7 billion reduction in spending, how on earth can we tackle our $15 trillion debt, $15,000 billion debt? Or consider food stamp programs. Federal welfare spending is now about $700 billion a year, $700 billion a year in the total welfare programs. It's more than 900 when you count state obligations or contributions that they make to these programs. Food stamps are the fastest growing major item in the welfare budget. They've quadrupled in 10 years. The food stamp program is one of 18 federal nutritional support programs in the budget. One of 18. The number of people receiving food stamps has climbed from about 1 in 50 when the program began to almost 1 in 7 today. Some of the more than 45 million people receiving food stamps exceed the program's eligibility requirements. They have higher income or higher assets than you're supposed to have to qualify. But they receive the benefits because they get them as a reciprocal benefit for other federal benefits that they get. They qualify for one program, they're categorically, therefore, entitled to food stamp programs, even though they don't meet the basic requirements. And reports of fraud and abuse are widespread. We were promised recommendations by the chairwoman of the Agriculture Committee for how the Super Committee could achieve savings in the agriculture budget, of which food stamps is the largest component of the entire agriculture budget, by far dwarfing other expenditures like aid to farmers. And they were supposed to arrive, the senator promised, by November 1st, but we've not seen that yet. So, the sad truth is our Democratic-led Senate has not met its responsibility to help this nation confront its most serious threat, and that is the debt we have. It's the greatest economic danger of our time, as we've repeatedly been warned. If we ultimately fail to control federal spending, which has nearly doubled in 10 years, we will experience a debt crisis that leads to loss of jobs, loss of growth, and loss of economic opportunity. Such a crisis will hurt those with less income the most. It's our duty to stop the occurrence of this very preventable tragedy. Instead of the irresponsible spending favored by the political class, it's time for Washington to be more accountable, to focus on the middle class. That means creating jobs through the private sector, producing more American energy, keeping our wealth at home, making the government lean and productive, a servant of the American people, confronting our dangerously rising debt, which threatens our economy and jobs, adopting a globally competitive tax code, upholding the rule of law and trade, eliminating unwise, damaging regulations, and finally, delivering the good people of this country the honest and responsible budget they deserve. Mr. President, we've got a long way to go. I'm disappointed that we can't even comply with the intent of the Budget Control Act passed this summer. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.